British democracy just delivered its most devastating verdict in modern political history. Keir Starmer has lost a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons by a margin so catastrophic, so overwhelming and so humiliating that his government has completely crumbled in what experts are calling the most historic parliamentary defeat ever recorded. This isn't a close vote where a handful of rebels made the difference. This is total collapse, with massive numbers of Starmer's own Labour MPs abandoning him and voting with the opposition to declare that they have no confidence in his ability to lead the country. The final vote count was absolutely crushing. 387 MPs voted that they have no confidence in Starmer's government, while only 152 voted to support him. Let that sink in. More than 70% of the House of Commons just told the Prime Minister that he has lost their confidence and that his government cannot continue. This includes over 100 Labour MPs who crossed party lines to vote against their own leader. A betrayal of such magnitude that it represents complete repudiation, not just of Starmer personally, but of everything his government has done and everything it stands for. The scenes in the Commons chamber when the results were announced were extraordinary. Opposition benches erupted in celebration, while the Labour benches sat in stunned, devastated silence. Some Labour MPs who had voted against Starmer looked relieved, as if a massive burden had been lifted by finally standing up against corruption and incompetence they had been enabling for too long. Others who had supported him looked shell-shocked, unable to process that their government had just fallen in the most humiliating way possible. Starmer himself sat frozen, his face pale, his hands shaking, apparently unable to accept what had just happened. The Speaker had to call for order multiple times as the chamber descended into chaos, with MPs shouting, some celebrating, others trying to understand what would happen next now that the government had lost the confidence of Parliament. This is the moment that every scandal, every exposure of corruption, every constitutional violation, every lie has been leading to. All the investigations, all the court rulings, all the public outrage finally culminated in Parliament itself declaring that Starmer has lost the right to govern and that his administration must end immediately. The vote of no confidence had been tabled by the leader of the opposition after weeks of building pressure following the revelation of Starmer's offshore accounts. Angela Rayner's devastating testimony about systemic corruption within his government and the Parliamentary Standards Committee report that had recommended his expulsion. The opposition had calculated that the accumulation of scandals and the growing dissent within Labour ranks meant that a confidence vote might actually succeed where previous attempts had failed. They were proven spectacularly correct. The debate before the vote was intense and emotional, with speaker after speaker from across the political spectrum making the case that Starmer had lost all legitimacy to govern and that Parliament had an obligation to remove a government that had betrayed public trust so completely. The opposition leader opened the debate by systematically cataloguing Starmer's failures and scandals. The £124,000 in undeclared payments from government contractors, the £8 million hidden in offshore accounts to avoid taxes, the billions in corrupt procurement contracts awarded to political cronies, the secret EU negotiations designed to overturn the Brexit referendum through deception rather than through democratic process, the Supreme Court ruling that found his conduct incompatible with the office of Prime Minister, the lies told to Parliament when questioned about these matters, the attempts to shield himself from judicial accountability through unconstitutional legislation that the King had to block. Each scandal was presented with supporting evidence and documentation, creating comprehensive indictment that was impossible to deny or to minimise. Opposition MPs from multiple parties spoke about the damage Starmer had done to British democracy, to public trust in government, to the rule of law, and to Britain's international standing and reputation. They argued that allowing him to remain in office sent message that corruption carried no consequences and that leaders could violate every standard and principle, as long as they maintained parliamentary majority through party discipline. They contended that Parliament had a duty to the British people to remove a government that had so thoroughly betrayed them and to allow voters to choose new leadership through general election. The moral and constitutional case for the vote of no confidence was presented as overwhelming and undeniable, with the only question being whether Labour MPs would have the courage to put country before party and to vote against their own leader when his unfitness had been so clearly demonstrated. Several opposition speakers appealed directly to Labour backbenchers' consciences, asking them to imagine explaining to their constituents why they had voted to keep in power a Prime Minister who had been found corrupt by courts, who had stolen from taxpayers through hidden offshore accounts, and who had systematically lied about all of it. The challenge was simple. Are you going to be complicit in protecting corruption, or are you going to stand up for the principles you claim to believe in? The most dramatic and devastating speeches came from Labour MPs, who announced they would be voting no confidence in their own government. These were not minor backbenchers, but senior figures, some who had served in Starmer's cabinet, others who had been loyal supporters throughout his rise to power. One after another, they rose to explain why they could no longer support a leader who had betrayed everything they thought they were fighting for. A former cabinet minister gave an emotional speech describing how she had believed Starmer's promises about integrity and how shattered she felt discovering that he had been systematically corrupt while presenting himself as reformer. She said that voting no confidence in her own government was the hardest decision of her political career, but that her obligation to her constituents and to her own integrity left her no choice. Another Labour MP, who had been one of Starmer's earliest supporters, described the gradual realisation that the corruption wasn't just worse than they'd initially understood, but was absolutely systematic and deliberate. This MP said that the offshore accounts revelation had been the final straw, proving that Starmer had been stealing from British taxpayers while claiming to represent working people. The decision to vote no confidence was about salvaging some shred of credibility and showing that not everyone in Labour was willing to protect corruption no matter what. Perhaps the most powerful speech came from a Labour backbencher representing a working class constituency who had voted Labour for generations. This MP described receiving hundreds of messages from constituents demanding to know why their MP was still supporting someone who had been proven to be corrupt. The MP read some of these messages directly, powerful testimonies from ordinary people expressing anger, betrayal and disgust at what Starmer had done. One constituent asked how anyone could claim to represent working people while hiding millions in offshore accounts to avoid paying taxes that everyone else had to pay. Another constituent said they had voted Labour their entire life but would never vote for the party again if it continued to protect Starmer's corruption. The MP said that listening to these constituents and recognising how completely Starmer had betrayed their trust made the decision clear. Voting no confidence wasn't an act of disloyalty to the party. It was an act of loyalty to the principle the party was supposed to represent and to the people the party was supposed to serve. These speeches from Labour MPs broke whatever remained of party discipline and gave permission to dozens of others who had been torn between loyalty and principle to follow their consciences and vote no confidence. The government's defence during the debate was weak and unconvincing, with ministers struggling to find any argument that could justify confidence in Starmer's leadership, given everything that had been exposed. They fell back on claims that the scandals were being exaggerated for political purposes, that Starmer deserved credit for some policy achievements regardless of personal misconduct, and that removing the government through confidence vote rather than through scheduled election was somehow undemocratic. But these arguments collapsed under scrutiny. The scandals weren't exaggerated. They were documented by courts, by parliamentary investigations, by whistleblower testimony, and by financial records. The policy achievements, such as they were completely overshadowed by systematic corruption that had stolen billions from taxpayers. And the claim that confidence votes were undemocratic was absurd when they existed precisely as mechanism for Parliament to remove governments that had lost the right to govern. The weakness of the government's defence probably convinced more wavering MPs to vote no confidence than if ministers had simply stayed silent. When you can't mount credible defence of your leader and you're reduced to procedural objections and whataboutism, you're essentially admitting that the charges are true and that you have no legitimate reason for anyone to maintain confidence in the government. As the debate continued through the afternoon and into the evening, it became increasingly clear that the government was heading for devastating defeat. The body language of Labour MPs told the story, with many looking resigned to what was coming and some appearing almost relieved that the ordeal would soon be over. Starmer himself sat on the front bench looking increasingly isolated and disconnected, conferring occasionally with the few remaining loyalists, but largely sitting in silence as speaker after speaker explained why they had no confidence in his leadership. When the division bells finally rang to call the vote, MPS filed through the lobbies with unprecedented solemnity, everyone aware they were participating in a historic moment that would be remembered and studied for generations. The lobbies were crowded and the counting took longer than usual as tellers verified every vote multiple times, given the significance of the result. When the speaker finally stood to read out the totals, the chamber went silent in anticipation. 387 MPS voted no confidence, 152 voted confidence. The government had lost by 235 votes. The magnitude of the defeat was stunning, even to those who had expected the government to lose. This wasn't narrow defeat where few rebels made the difference. This was complete collapse, where the government had lost the confidence of nearly 3/4 of Parliament, including massive numbers from its own party. The immediate aftermath of the vote was chaotic as MPS and observers tried to process what had happened and what it meant. Constitutional Convention was clear: a government that loses confidence vote must resign, and the Prime Minister must either recommend to the monarch who should form new government or must request dissolution of Parliament and general election. But Starmer's initial reaction suggested he might try to defy even this basic constitutional principle. He left the chamber immediately after the vote was announced, reportedly telling aides that he would not resign and that the vote was illegitimate. This delusional response showed how completely disconnected from reality Starmer had become, apparently believing he could simply ignore a confidence vote he'd lost by 235 votes. His senior cabinet members, recognising that such defiance would trigger immediate constitutional crisis and would make everything even worse, reportedly confronted him within hours and made clear that resignation was not optional. They explained that if he refused to resign, they would resign collectively. The king would have no choice but to dismiss him as Prime Minister, and he would be physically prevented from continuing to exercise governmental functions. Faced with this reality and with his complete lack of support or authority, Starmer finally accepted the inevitable and submitted his resignation to King Charles, formally ending his disastrous government. The political implications of the historic confidence vote defeat extended far beyond just Starmer's personal fate. The Labour Party faced existential crisis, having watched their government collapse with over 100 of their own MPs voting no confidence. The divisions within the party were so deep and so public that it was unclear whether the party could hold together as coherent political force. Those MPs who had voted no confidence were heroes to many voters, but were viewed as traitors by party loyalists who believed you never vote against your own government regardless of circumstances. Those MPs who had voted confidence despite everything that had been exposed found themselves facing fury from constituents who demanded to know why they had protected corruption. The party's electoral prospects were in ruins, with polling showing support at historic lows that suggested Labour might be reduced to minor party status in any election. The question of who would lead Labour going forward was complicated by the fact that anyone too closely associated with Starmer was toxic, but anyone who had opposed him too vocally might be unacceptable to remaining party establishment. The rebuilding challenge was enormous and would take years if it could be accomplished at all. The constitutional questions raised by the confidence vote defeat and Starmer's initial resistance to resigning sparked serious discussions about whether Britain's unwritten constitution needed to be more codified, or whether the system's flexibility had proven able to handle even unprecedented crisis. Some argued that Starmer's ability to defy basic constitutional conventions like resigning after losing confidence votes showed need for clearer rules with enforcement mechanisms that didn't depend on good faith compliance. Others contended that the system had ultimately worked, that Starmer had been forced to resign through a combination of political pressure and institutional resistance to his continued presence, and that over-codifying would sacrifice valuable flexibility for false sense of security. The reforms that emerged from these debates focused on clarifying succession procedures and creating mechanisms to ensure smooth governmental transitions even when outgoing leaders proved recalcitrant or difficult. But there was recognition that no constitutional system could be made completely proof against determined bad actors, and that ultimately democratic governance depended on a combination of good rules and good faith, actors willing to follow both formal requirements and informal norms. The public reaction to the confidence vote defeat was overwhelmingly positive, with massive majorities celebrating Parliament's decision to remove Starmer's government. There was satisfaction that accountability had finally been enforced, and that even a Prime Minister with parliamentary majority couldn't survive when his corruption became undeniable and when enough MPs found the courage to put principle before party. Spontaneous celebrations erupted across Britain when news of the vote spread, with people gathering in public squares and outside Parliament to mark the end of Starmer's government and to express hope that what came next would be better and more honest. But underneath the celebration was serious reflection about how someone so corrupt had been able to achieve the highest office, and about what needed to change to prevent future Starmers from rising to power. The demands for political reform, for stronger vetting and oversight, for better whistleblower protections, for enhanced financial disclosure requirements, all of these became central features of political discourse in the aftermath of Starmer's fall. The vote of no confidence was seen not as endpoint, but as beginning of necessary process of reform and renewal. The immediate priority following Starmer's resignation was establishing new government that could command confidence of Parliament and could provide stable governance while general election was organised. The King consulted with party leaders across the political spectrum to determine who might be able to form government in the interim period. The mathematical reality was that no party had clear majority after the confidence vote had demonstrated Labour's parliamentary support had completely collapsed. An interim coalition government was formed, including Conservative and Liberal Democrat MPs, along with Labour members who had voted no confidence in Starmer, tasked with managing routine government business and preparing for elections without making major policy decisions that should be left to elected government. This unusual arrangement was accepted as necessary given the extraordinary circumstances, though everyone understood it was a temporary measure until voters could be consulted. The general election was scheduled for 2 months hence, giving parties time to select candidates and to make their cases to voters about who should govern Britain post-Starmer. The election campaign that followed was unlike any in modern British history, dominated completely by the Starmer scandals and by competing narratives about accountability and reform. Labour, under hastily selected new leadership, attempted to distance themselves from Starmer while arguing they had learnt from the disaster and had implemented reforms that would prevent future corruption. But voters remained deeply sceptical, with the confidence vote having exposed that over 100 Labour MPs had protected Starmer until the very end, despite knowing about his corruption. The Conservative Party ran on themes of restoring integrity and competence to government, though they faced questions about why they hadn't been more effective in opposing Starmer earlier. Smaller parties gained support from voters looking for alternatives to the major parties they'd lost faith in. When election results came in, they represented massive realignment of British politics, with Labour suffering historically bad defeat, losing hundreds of seats and being reduced to smaller parliamentary presence than at any time in the modern era.